Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, March 27th, 2025, and our friends David Gibbs and Graham Fuller are back with us. Welcome back.
Thank you, Nima.
Thank you for having me, Nima.
Let's get started with the situation between the United States and Iran. Basically, we have three parties of analysts who are one of them believe that this is all about a show to intimidate Iran. The other party, the other two parties believe that the United States would attack Iran by conventional sort of weapons, and one of them believes that the United States would definitely use nuclear bombs. And what your assessment, Graham? Let's get started with you. What's your assessment of the way that the Trump administration is behaving? Is the war getting is the situation getting to the point that the Trump administration would definitely bomb Iran?
Well, when we talked about this a week or two ago, Nima, I was a bit more positive, and I said I really did not think that Trump wanted war with Iran. He may not want war with Iran, but that doesn't mean we won't end up going there. But I'm a little more concerned right now because the level of rhetoric has been going up. And as you noted earlier, the amount of American weapons and ships and aircraft that have been deployed to the area is disturbing. I mean, one does not necessarily lightly deploy such weapons at great expense and at great distance simply to send some threats. It's possible. When you mentioned Scott Ritter, I have great respect for Scott Ritter, but I would have to say, in this case, I really do not believe at all that the United States would use nuclear weapons against Iran. I mean, that would that, as we all know, that opens the door to a wild and dangerous new world that I think is virtually unthinkable. So, however irrational Trump may be on occasion, I do not think he will think in those terms. There is still the possibility that this is all attempt to pressure, to intimidate Iran, but I am very much concerned about the Israeli role in all of this. That Israel might not find some way to provoke an event or an incident that would, let's say, an attack against the U.S. forces that seem to be coming from Hamas or some other pro Iranian force that could lead the U.S. in. I doubt it, but I am more worried than I have been before.
It seems, David, that Graham is trying to somehow say that maybe Israel goes after somehow false flag operations against the United States that make these sort of conflict just hidden up.
Benjamin Netanyahu is an extraordinarily manipulative figure. And as far as we can tell, he has always wanted to bait the United States into war with Iran. Israel does have some capacity to strike Iran, but nowhere near what would be necessary to completely eliminate Iran's nuclear facilities. That would require the United States, the U.S. Air Force and Navy to step in. It's not even clear we have that capability, by the way, because the materials are so dispersed and buried underground. But nevertheless, I think he has always seen getting the United States into war with Iran as an objective. And who knows what kind of deceitful thing he would do to make that happen. I agree with everything Graham Fuller said about the augmented risks here, including both the rhetoric and also the enhanced deployments in the region. The problem is once you engage in warlike rhetoric and warlike deployments, there will be considerable pressure on you to use them. That's just the way the world works. I'm still somewhat optimistic that Trump, despite an extraordinarily reckless style and a tendency to say incredibly warlike things, he actually, if you look at his first term, you have to look at what he's done in the past, in my view. That's what you have to look at, what he's done. His first term was significantly less warlike than that of Biden. and significantly less warlike even than that of Obama. It was one of the, frankly, least warlike presidencies we've had since 1945 in terms of what he actually did. And I do sense he has a real skepticism about the value of overseas interventions. If you look at his campaign rhetoric, he has intermixed bellicose warlike rhetoric with extraordinarily non-warlike rhetoric, criticizing the warmongers, criticizing Liz Cheney as a radical war hawk, as he called her. And so he could go in either direction. If I had to bet, I would bet that he would back down in some way, find some way of backing down. I do think part of what he's doing, it's just a guess, is trying to look tough on Iran, just to impress everybody how tough he is, but also to take the heat off him for negotiating with the Russians. He's, of course, taking a lot of criticism for negotiating with the Russians. He's giving in to Putin. He's an instrument of Putin. He's a puppet of Putin, all of these things. You're hearing these things on a regular basis from his critics. I, for one, think actually negotiating with the Russians is an excellent idea. I can't imagine why that's being criticized. Talking to your adversary is what you should do. It's always what you should do. It doesn't matter whether you like them or don't like them. That's irrelevant to the issue. But nevertheless, he is being criticized for that and trying to show how tough he is in Iran as a way of alleviating the pressure. But in the end, I assume he will do what he did in his first term, which is seemingly go up to the point of actually engaging in a strike and then backing down. Bear in mind, there was also a crisis where he came very close to striking Iran, but did back down at the last moment. According to the New York Times, at least, Tucker Carlson spoke to him, and he said that the American people elected you not to start not to start new wars. That's not why the American people elected you. That apparently weighed upon him. And Trump is, I'm not a fan of Trump, let me say that, but nevertheless, he does seem to have more of a greater skepticism of intervention than most of the foreign policy establishment. And I'm assuming that will ultimately prevail in this case. Let me add, if he does go to war with Iran, if he does actually do any kind of military strike against Iran, there's a very high risk of that being absolutely catastrophic in the sense that he probably won't be able to eliminate all of Iran's nuclear facilities. In any case, once he does undertake a strike like that, Iran will be under great pressure down the road to develop nuclear facilities, and there'd be pressure to depose the government of Iran through some kind of military action on the ground. Now, just trying to imagine what it would be like for the US to actually invade Iran, a country of, 90 to 100 million people, something of that sort. I don't know the exact population, but it would be like the Iraq War multiplied several times. We all know how the Iraq War went. And I think Trump himself very much knows how the Iraq War went. So again, I think all of those factors will weigh against any kind of strike by the Trump administration. That's my hope, anyway.
Two things.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
If I could just add to that, I absolutely agree with David on that. And I'm glad he brought up the question of, two questions. What makes me more disturbed about the Israeli side of the equation is the discussion by Israel in particular and by some of more pro-Israeli hawks in the United States is this fascination with the decapitation scenario. In other words, you don't have to go to war, you just decapitate the leadership. Well, first of all, obviously the Iranians have thought about that, but that would be a very, very fearsome and scary scenario if the U.S. got into that. And secondly, I think another slight breaking, something that would break or slow down U.S. aggressiveness in that are the very Ukrainian negotiations themselves. Trump obviously places very high importance on the Ukrainian negotiations, and I totally support him on this. I think this is the best aspect of Trump's foreign policy, actually, to date. And if he were to attack Iran, I think you could virtually kiss goodbye to any kind of rapprochement or settlement in Ukraine, simply because it would be interpreted as a stunning blow against a country with whom Russia has close ties, not an ally, but very close, important geostrategic ties.
The point is, as David, you've mentioned, is if the United States decides to attack Iran, then they would convince Iranians to go after nuclear bombs. And it's not just about Iran, it's about Turkey, about Saudi Arabia. Many of these countries would feel that sort of threat coming from the United States. Here is what John Mearsheimer said about the nuclear bombs.
There's no question that a nuclear-armed Iran would bring stability to the region because nuclear weapons are weapons of peace. They're weapons of deterrence. They have hardly any offensive capability at all. And if Iran had a nuclear deterrent, there's no way that the United States or Israel, for that matter, would be threatening to attack Iran now. In the same way that if Saddam had had nuclear weapons in 2003, the United States would not have invaded Iraq. And if Libya had nuclear weapons in 2011, the United States would not have gone to war against Libya. So I think that if you had a Middle East where other states besides Israel, and this of course includes Iran, had a nuclear deterrent, it would be a more peaceful region. Well, it's possible there'll be some proliferation. I wouldn't bet against the fact that maybe Turkey or Saudi Arabia would acquire nuclear weapons, but people have been predicting widespread proliferation for decades now, and it's never happened. But I think there are two reasons that it wouldn't happen. One is that the Iranians would not be able to blackmail anybody in the neighborhood with their nuclear weapons. We've created this myth in this country over the past few years in talking about Iran that any country that acquires nuclear weapons can blackmail other countries or use those nuclear weapons for offensive purposes. We have a lot of theory and a huge amount of empirical evidence, 67 years now, which show that no country with nuclear weapons can blackmail another country as long as somebody is protecting that country or it has its own nuclear weapons. And this leads to the second reason. The United States is going to extend its nuclear umbrella over Saudi Arabia and over Turkey, the way it extended it over Germany and Japan during the Cold War. And we will make it perfectly clear to the Iranians that they cannot blackmail anybody. So there'll be no great incentive for Turkey or for Saudi Arabia to acquire nuclear weapons.
David, the point is that John is mentioning is if they feel, as you mentioned, the point that you've raised, do you think that the United States, we know that Donald Trump was talking about the nukes, the quantity of nukes that the United States possess and Russia possess. He wants to negotiate with Russia in terms of nuclear weapons. He wants to reduce the capabilities. If that's the policy, how is he going to make a conflict in the Middle East, which would, as you've mentioned, convince these countries to go after nuclear bombs?
Well, let me just first comment on what John Mearsheimer said. Let me say at the outset that John Mearsheimer is one of the most brilliant, and I don't use that term lightly, and I'm certainly not just trying to flatter him, but he is one of the most brilliant and courageous intellectuals we have today. And I really very much admire what he's been doing, but I disagree with him on this particular point. He has always said that nuclear weapons are weapons of peace. He's against the idea of denuclearization. On the contrary, he sees, for example, Iran having nuclear weapons as a stabilizing variable. I strongly disagree with that. It seems to me this is short-sighted in my view, that nuclear weapons are incredibly dangerous. And it seems inevitable that at some point, if we continue on the road we've been continuing, at some point nuclear weapons will be used. And just statistically, at any given point, there's always some possibility of something going wrong, iterated over a long period of time, that virtually guarantees they will be used. There's always a risk of that. If there's a risk over time, that's inevitable. We're close to inevitable. And the more countries that have nuclear weapons, the greater the risk of something going wrong. A leader acting irrationally, or a misunderstood radar image, or something of that sort. We came a couple of times very close to nuclear war during the Cold War, very, very close indeed, as we found, based upon newly available evidence. The CIA, if I'm not mistaken, had predicted that at one point, during the successful Ukrainian offensive in the Kherson region and the north of Kharkiv, that the Russians maybe were at the point of 50-50 about using tactical nuclear weapons. So the idea that these will never be used is wishful thinking, I think. And we've been extremely lucky over the past 70 years or so that they haven't been used, but luck invariably runs out. and it will run out with this matter too. And so I don't share that kind of optimism that we're seeing here. And the idea of having another nuclear power or 2 or 3 nuclear powers is just one more factor of destabilization in the world. So anyway, so with regard to your second question, I'm sorry, I forgot your direct question, Nima. Could you just repeat it for me?
And the question would be how this attitude on if the United States is looking after reducing nuclear bombs
Oh,
and
yes,
nuclear
yes.
capabilities, what they're doing this in the Middle East.
One of the most astonishing and one of the most optimistic, from my standpoint, things that Trump has said, and again, who knows if he means it, and he probably doesn't, but he did say that one of the things he wants to do as a priority is to meet not only with Putin, but with Xi of China and work out an arrangement for a 50% a 3-way reduction in military spending with an emphasis on reducing nuclear weapons spending. And if he were to do that, if he were to pull it off, if he were to pull that or even something close to that off, that would be a remarkable achievement in my view. The fact that he's even talking about it is a great source of optimism to me. I frankly doubt he will for a variety of reasons. I don't think he has the kind of focus or the kind of diplomatic skill to pull off something like that, although who knows? Let's wait and see. But he has said that, and that's something no president in recent years has said anything like that. And that's a good thing. This fact that he said it is a good thing.
Nima, if I could just very briefly add to that, I fully agree with David. I think, can you imagine, I mean, John Mearsheimer, as we both of us have a great admiration for him over the long haul, but can you imagine Congress actually buying into a pointed-headed Harvard, Chicago University intellectual who assures us that having a bomb in Iran is actually better for the region and safer for the region? Can you imagine the Israeli lobby, what their reaction would be to that kind of thing? So even if it makes sense, I think it's absolutely unsellable in the United States.
Graham, moments ago, before coming up to this live, we've learned that Iran has responded to the letter of Donald Trump. And in your opinion, what was asked on the part of the United States in that letter that they've sent to Iran? Are they asking for, it's all about the nuclear program of Iran? Is it related to the axis of resistance and the way that they're supporting the axis of resistance? It's all together. And what's your speculation on the response coming from Iran?
Nima, I'm sorry I have not had a chance to see that response coming from Iran. You say it was today.
It was today. Nobody knows, Graham. I'm not talking. I want you to speculate on that because nobody knows what was in the letter that Donald Trump sent to Iran.
Yeah,
and we had Witkoff. Let me play a clip. Witkoff talking about the letter that they've sent to Iran. Here is what Witkoff said.
With that all said, he wrote that letter. And why did he write that letter?
For people who aren't aware of the letter, can you just roughly describe what it said?
It roughly said, I'm a president of peace. That's what I want. There's no reason for us to do this militarily. We should talk. We should clear up the misconceptions. We should create a verification program so that nobody worries about weaponization of your nuclear material. And I'd like to get us to that place because the alternative is not a very good alternative. That's a rough encapsulation of what was said, roughly.
Yeah, well, my sense of that, those comments by Witkoff, is that simply Trump is talking across the boards on relations between the United States and Iran. This involves all kinds of the nuclear issue. It involves issues of so-called Iranian proxies. It involves actions of Hamas and Hezbollah in the area or Houthis in the area. So I think Trump is really maybe going for the grand prize in the sense of being able to overcome, if he's able to overcome the kinds of problems that we have with Russia in Ukraine and beyond that, I think he thinks it would be an even greater accomplishment if he was able to cover almost all of these issues of contention between Iran and the United States that go back now, for virtually 50 years, and involve all kinds of issues, including huge demonization of Iran in the United States, and certainly in the Iran demonization, literally by the Iranian regime, and calling America the Shaitan-e Bozorg, the great devil. So I think I'm encouraged by the kind of things that Witkoff said, because he's implying that the letter was not written in a very belligerent style, but maybe a transactional style. Surely we can do business together, and we both know that the results of not being able to do business together would be very undesirable for all of us. So I would like to think Trump is going for the big picture, and he's not unaware that this is related to U.S. ties with Russia.
David, do you see any sort of correlation between the way that Witkoff was talking about it and the way that the United States is behaving militarily?
Hard to say. It could be a carrot and stick aspect. On the one hand, the U.S. is clearly, let me say generally, the United States has long felt it has the right to bully other countries, and countries have no right to defend themselves. The U.S. likes vassals that it can control, and that's how it sees Iran. Apart from international law or any kind of abstract morality, has nothing to do with this. The U.S. just sees it as its inherent right to bully countries, and that's has always been what it's been trying to do with Iran. And I think in the case of Trump, the fact that what Witkoff talked about him trying to present himself as a man of peace to Iran, he did use that word, a man of peace, is very different from the sort of saber rattling we're seeing with the troop deployments and so on. And so there could be the carrot and stick aspect, as I said. And I think in the end, Trump will simply think of some way of finessing this and backing down and not going to war. Again, that's not guaranteed, but that's my hope. And we're seeing here contradictory actions that point in that direction, giving some optimism.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Nima, that the popular concept somehow in the United States is that Israel faces this terrible enemy of Iran, and so a great deal of this is done with Israel and Israel's interests in mind. But if anybody thinks, either in Israel or Washington, that the only country that is quite bitterly anti-Israeli, that only country would be Iran, they're crazy. I mean, by now, even before this business of the genocide in Gaza, the hatred against Israel by now, given the policies against Gaza, are enraging the entire world all the way to Indonesia, the Muslim world all the way to Indonesia, and indeed much of the global South that sees, as David says, this is part of a pattern of American bullying. So the idea that somehow getting rid of Iran would reduce the idea of Muslim anger against Israel is preposterous. If anything, it would increase hostility to Iran, to Israel, who see Iran as really one of the few Muslim countries standing up for Palestinian rights, along with the Houthis.
David, it seems that in the mind of the United States and those people in power, the decision makers in the United States, Iran is the main reason of instability in the region, considering this case of Israel. And they see if there is no Iran, if there is no Republic of Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran, there would be no resistance against Israel. This is the way that Donald Trump the administration of Donald Trump is trying to picture the situation. We know that this picture comes from the Israelis, but what's your take on that? Because we know before the revolution in Iran, during the Shah, it was resistance existed even before the revolution in Iran. It's not something new. It's not something created by Iran. What's your take on that and the mindset on the part of the United States?
I think there's a ideology I've spoken of before on Pascal Taz's show, neoconservatism, which emerged in the 1970s, which very much saw Israel as a model for what the United States should be like. The way the neoconservatives viewed Israel was as this militarily hyper-efficient country that did not defend, they attacked, and they sought decisive victory. They tended to whitewash the ways in which Israel often could be very inefficient and did not achieve decisive victory, but they focused upon what they saw in their eyes was the positive, which is when Israel decisively defeated their enemies. And that was very appealing to neoconservatives, and they felt that Israel's unapologetic use of military force to crush their enemies, disregard of international law, and a kind of abstract morality was exactly the way the United States should go. Also, Israel, it's not that Israel never negotiates, they do negotiate, but they have a strong preference for not negotiating and using military force to solve all problems. That was the neoconservative idea, and that gradually took greater and greater influence in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, whereby today, up till Trump, it was almost the unanimous view of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, neoconservatism. It was very difficult to talk about neoconservatism as a distinctive idea because there was hardly anybody in the foreign policy establishment, again, before Trump, who wasn't a neocon. And there was this idea not only of uncritical U.S. support for Israel, but much more than that. The U.S. should look to Israel as a model for what we should do. And that simply using force or backing the Israelis to do force for us is the way to go. And so, there's been this debate as to whether or not Israel controls the United States or the U.S. controls Israel. I think it's a little bit different from that, and that the Israeli idea is in the U.S. government. It's what the U.S. government does, is the Israeli idea. And so I think that's the main consideration here in terms of how this goes. I think another context of this is that, sure, Iran is the only country that officially is hostile to Israeli objectives. But I think what this ignores, as Graham Fuller noted, is the Arab public opinion and Muslim public opinion and broader global public opinion, particularly in the global South, which has become extremely hostile to the viciousness of what Israel is doing, especially in Gaza, the mass killing of civilians, killing of children, and so on. This has made Israel extremely unpopular. One doesn't like to, I hate to use the word terrorism because it's been so overused and lacks definition, but what's loosely called terrorism is something that one uses when all other methods don't work. The blowing up of civilian installations, the attacks on civilians. This is a real risk the U.S. is taking here by backing Israel. It's a risk the U.S. has always taken, that there'd be terrorist attacks against American targets, as, for example, in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. There's no doubt, if you look at the record of people like Osama bin Laden, one of the major motives was U.S. support for Israel. And that's hardly surprising. I mean, that doesn't justify the attacks. They're not justifiable, but it makes them comprehensible. And I think the U.S. is once again playing with fire here. Because by backing Israel to the hilt, even when Israel is killing hundreds of thousands of mostly innocent people, that produces such fury and anger, there's likely to be a backlash, and it could be a violent backlash. And it could also be against not just Israel, but against the United States. And I think people in Washington should worry about those types of consequences more than they do.
Graham, your take. What's your take? And
No, I absolutely agree with David. I've said on several occasions now that we haven't even begun to see a backlash of terrorism beginning. If you consider the number of Palestinians who have lost fathers, sons, daughters, children of all kinds, mothers, the cry for revenge is going to be very deep. Even if only one out of, let's say, 100 Palestinian families who are Palestinian family members, who have been killed in one way or another in these bombings and shootings. Just 1 out of 100, that still would suggest a major wave of terrorism, certainly against Israel, and absolutely because the United States has been locked in fully hip to hip, if you will, with Israel on supporting this kind of genocide. The United States will not be freed or from any forgiveness for its involvement in these things. I think this kind of thing could go on for decades of revenge seeking, even into the next generation of people who were little children when their father was killed. I hate to say it, but violence begets violence.
David, when did you see the communication among the Trump administration's officials? And they were talking about the bomb in Yemen. And one of the things that the vice president mentioned is that this Red Sea is so much critical to Europeans, not that much to us. So I hate to take actions against Yemenis, but we have to do it because of Israel. And how do you find, what's your take on the communication and the way they were communicating among each other? And
Well, it does show just the communication itself, the very idea that the U.S. sort of brazenly feels the right to bomb other countries without any reasonable justification, any defensive justification is extraordinary. And once again, we're seeing this one more iteration of this sort of imperial arrogance and disregard for international law. That shouldn't surprise us. It's noteworthy. I think the controversy over the leaking of the plan of attack to Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic is the minor point, I think, is that it indicates to me possibly that the man who did it, Waltz, the national security advisor, may very well be leaking information to harm President Trump. The reason I say that is Goldberg has long been an enemy of Trump, was a major factor promoting the idea of the Russiagate scandal against Trump, and has been a leading neocon critic of Trump. And so the fact that it was leaked to Goldberg, to me, seems very suspicious and makes me wonder if Waltz is about to be fired as a disloyal figure who's leaking information. That's just speculation. I don't really know. I think the larger issue here, and of course it was an act of gross incompetence. There's very hard to see it any other way. But I think the main feature here in terms of the controversy is a very typical Washington inside the Beltway distraction from the larger question of not who leaked the document and should they have leaked the document and that kind of thing, but should we be bombing another country? It tends to distract from that larger issue. And why are we going around bombing another country? J.D. Vance is, of course, right. The Suez Canal is much more important to Europe than it is to the United States. But I think the main country we're doing this on behalf of is not Europe, but Israel, because it was, after all, Israeli shipping that was being attacked. And so I think Vance is trying to evade that issue. I'm not quite sure why. There's no doubt that the Houthis were clearly directing their strikes to harm not Europe per se, but to harm Israel on account of its violation of the ceasefire and the continued destruction of human life in Gaza. It's very striking that for all the anger, that smoldering anger that we've been discussing here against what Israel is doing, there's been remarkably virtually no real reaction from the Arab world in terms of concrete counteraction against Israel, the only exception being Yemen. And that's taking place actively, and the U.S. is trying to end that. So I think that's a larger issue. Just in Washington, this always happens, that when information is leaked, the question isn't what was the U.S. doing and why is the U.S. doing it, but rather who leaked the information. And the press loves to focus on trivia like that.
Yeah. Nima, if I could just add to that.
Graham, go ahead.
No, go ahead if you had something.
Yeah, my question to you would be, if we know that, as David mentioned, JG, the editor of Atlantic, is so close to Dick Cheney, and he's sort of that's why they don't like Donald Trump. They do everything, as David mentioned.
They do.
But when it comes to the context, when it comes to the way that they were communicating, Waltz was mentioning in one of the comments, he said that we are tracking the guy who's the head of the bombing in Yemen, and he went to his girlfriend's uh, apartment in a building that we bombed him. Graham, in your opinion, if they know where this guy is and where he's going to, uh, where would be his way to get home, and why did they don't bomb him before getting to the building and just not killing more civilians instead of killing a lot of civilians because of one person in that building?
I can't comment on what is often extraordinary foolishness in terms of targeting this region. Just one other point. I'll come back to that. But the New York Times today had a piece about the Houthis and the Red Sea, and it commented. I had not been aware, but it commented that several months ago, large shipping companies had decided that they were too nervous about sending very huge, expensive tankers and cargo ships up through the Red Sea and at great risk, and decided that it would simply be cheaper in the long run and less anxiety involved to send them all the way around Africa. Yes, it might cost a little bit more, but in the end, it might not even be much more expensive compared to losing a ship. Secondly, I mean, there's a lot of Washington politics going on in this whole thing. I somehow doubt that this was really some terrible breach, security breach. Maybe technically it was that Goldberg was there, but this is typical Washington politics of trying to whip up a huge issue to, in this case, embarrass Trump, or could be to embarrass another president, but to try to paint a picture of further Trump incompetency as president. I just don't think it matters that much. It's a tempest in a teapot.
Somehow, David, it seems that we're witnessing Donald Trump changing its rhetoric toward Yemenis, because he said today or yesterday, he said that they desperately want peace with the United States. They're looking after peace with the United States. And we know that's, do you think that the administration is getting to the same point that the Biden administration has got?
I hope not. The administration only is a couple of months old, and I don't think they've found their footing yet in terms of how they're going to operate. And I think they could go in a lot of different directions. I think as a general point, a lot more countries, I think, want peace than the U.S. wants to admit. The U.S. just seems to have a need to find enemies. It was very striking if you look at the early 90s, something I've been looking at very carefully. The U.S. effectively had no enemies. And, the Soviet Union had disappeared. China was nowhere near what it is today. And I think in Washington, there were people openly lamenting the end of the Cold War. On the one hand, there was a certain enthusiasm that we'd won the Cold War, and that was such a good thing. But there's also a regret of its passing, and an open talk about we have to find some new enemies, a new enemy to justify the military budget, to justify overseas bases, maybe to draw the country together internally and solve our numerous internal disputes. And people were saying this very openly, half jokingly, but only half jokingly. And I think they, to some extent, meant it. And if you look for enemies, you'll find enemies. And that's what the U.S. has been doing all over the world. I think Iran is an easy enemy because we never forgave the Iranians for overthrowing the Shah, our close ally in the Gulf. Even though that was 50 years ago, we still haven't forgiven them for that. And of course, we really have not forgiven them for taking over the U.S. embassy and holding the U.S. Diplomats hostage. That was a humiliation for the United States. And so I think there's this almost vindictive animus towards the Iranians on that account, which doesn't make any sense. Why start a war with a country over a vendetta that is based upon something from that long ago? But that is to some extent how the United States operates. And there's an element of irrationality here, of a desire almost to stir up trouble where no trouble existed. I mean, In the case of Ukraine, of course, there was no need for a war. It could easily have been resolved diplomatically. The Russians made multiple attempts over years and decades, really, to resolve it diplomatically. But the U.S. clearly didn't want to do so. The U.S. wanted, in many respects, what you could look at the United States is doing since the end of the Cold War is trading security for power. We like power, we like exercising power, but it has come at the cost of heightened insecurity. And this is not a security policy. This is an insecurity policy. And the issue of saber rattling against Yemen and Iran, especially Iran, is another thing that'll weaken our security. And if we go to war, that'll really weaken our security.
Graham, if you remember where Donald Trump came to power, and he said he was trying to negotiate with Xi in China in order to put pressure on Russia in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, which didn't work. And he then went to talk with Russia and all of that we are aware of. But it seems right now with the conflict in Ukraine and the way that he's trying to negotiate with Russians, they're trying to draw a line between Russians and Iranians, or maybe Russian and Chinese. Do you think that the Russian strategy would change under the Trump, influenced by the Trump administration, or they're going to have the same sort of strategy as they had before Trump coming to power? Here is what Lavrov said.
Of a comprehensive partnership and a strategic interaction with China are very productive. Our strategic relations with India is developing, and the deepening of friendly ties with countries such as Islamic Republic of Iran and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea are flourishing.
Yeah. Do you see the Trump administration being capable of separating Russia from its allies, or they're gonna be smarter than that and find some sort of compromise and cooperation with Russia?
No, Nima, I do not think that if the Ukraine negotiations are primarily designed to try to split apart Russia from China, there's no way that's going to work. I think there are powerful reasons for Russia to want to reach a peaceful agreement, as there should be for the United States as well. So that's an independent issue. On top of that, I mean, as David has just pointed out, we are always on the relentless search for enemies, and China now is perhaps the juiciest, best enemy we've had in a very long time. So I think the issues of disagreement between China and the United States run far deeper than those between the United States and Russia. After all, Russia is no economic competitor to the United States in any serious way. Russia is not a full competitor with the United States, even militarily speaking, in the sense of the broad development of a huge range of weapons and war devices against the rest of the world. So the United States is now at least as deeply engaged in a trade war, and it is primarily China that has been the driving force behind the creation of the BRICS formation, now much expanded. And in my view, the BRICS and the Global South are actually going to be the forerunners of a new UN in not too terribly distant future. But the United States has really not yet been willing to grasp and understand the reality of BRICS or BRICS Plus or the Global South in what this means for U.S. global domination. That global domination is withering by the day, and there's no way that the United States can simply blame this on China. It's out of control, out of China's control, if you will, in many ways. So it's an entirely different order of conflict as far as I can see, and there will be no splitting apart, especially as long as the United States is determined to maintain and prove its hegemony in the world. There's no way that Russia or China or any other major BRICS powers would be willing to accept that American hegemony, and they would sympathize with the Russian-Chinese cooperation.
David, what do you think?
I think we're moving towards a realignment of international relations, somewhat along the lines that Graham mentioned, in the sense that the United States was, as for extended period, been declining as the world's unitary power. And that was inevitable given the rapid growth of China and other countries. And increasingly also resistance to American domination of the world order. And that was going to happen at some point, but it's been accelerated by the various wars in the world, which has caused other countries to move at a much heightened rate towards the BRICS. The BRICS clearly is the anti-American pole. I think nobody wants to say anti-American, but it is clearly, they're mobilizing against U.S. domination of the world order. That's the whole purpose of BRICS, really. I would add that the launching of the war in Ukraine, I do see this as something very much provoked by the United States, as having the intention of knocking Russia out of the League of the Great Powers, either establishing regime change and making it a vassal state of the United States, or perhaps breaking it up into pieces. That was openly being discussed. And again, why the United States feels it has a right to do this is another matter, but nevertheless, the U.S. does see it as itself as having that right. And I think that was very much openly the intention here, to defeat Russia, more, I think, through sanctions than militarily, but to defeat Russia one way or the other, to deprive China of a key ally, and also send a warning message to China that if we do this to Russia, we can do this to you as well, and establish submission from China, and then also establish submission from Iran and everybody else, pretty much, and reestablish, for the foreseeable future, a unipolar world dominated by the United States. I think that really was the program. As we can see, it failed miserably, and is failing miserably, and is having the opposite intention. It's convincing people. Nobody wants to bandwagon with a losing country, and the U.S. effectively is losing the war in Ukraine. It's not just, Ukraine is a pawn here. It's a pawn. And the main player is the United States and NATO. And as Ukraine is losing the war and Russia is winning the war, it's the United States ultimately that will lose credibility here. And that will further enhance the desirability of BRICS as a pole of interest and China as a central player in that pole of interest. The unceasing U.S. support for Israel and the horrific things Israel is doing, and doing quite openly, far worse than anything Russia is doing in Ukraine, just in terms of civilian casualties, just in terms of numbers here. This also is going to accelerate the loss of credibility of the United States, particularly at the moral level. You had someone like Antony Blinken very self-righteously talking about the rules-based order, and people in most of the world roll their eyes and say, what are you talking about, a rules-based order? Look what the U.S. and its allies are doing in that rules-based order. And all of that is going to accelerate U.S. decline. So I think that is really what is happening here.
Graham, from Vietnam to Iraq, did America learn or forget? And because right now, I think we're living a crucial moment. As you've mentioned, the biggest fight, the biggest competition is between the United States and China. And what do they want Middle East to be? As we talked before about the role of Iran, Turkey, as you mentioned, the two important countries in the Middle East. The other players are not that much important and influential. And when it comes to the eastern part of Europe, in Eurasia, nobody can ignore how important Russia is, how substantial, how crucial the role of Russia is. What does the United States want from these two countries? They cannot, in my opinion, they cannot separate one from another because they have security concerns together. That's why it's impossible to separate one from another. What is, in your opinion, if you were to advise the Trump administration in terms of the bigger picture of that region, what would you tell them? What would you suggest to them?
Well, Nima, you first mentioned from Vietnam to Iraq. I think that's a very significant issue. The United States basically never learns from these conflicts. Maybe historians may learn, some intelligent geopolitical analysts learn, but essentially the United States has not learned. On the contrary, sometimes the alternative narrative is what we hear, as we hear now in relation to the Ukraine struggle, that, well, whatever is going on in Ukraine, if we lose to Russia or give up to Russia, or if Russia is seen victorious, then that will have implications for the next struggle, and it will mean that China then will supposedly be emboldened to take on the United States over Taiwan. In other words, you can't ever afford to lose, or to be even perceived as losing a battle, because that is seemingly the beginning of the end of American domination, and perhaps so-called fear of American power. I just think there is huge denial. That's part of American politics, I'm afraid. Huge denial of what international realities are, and I'm afraid our intelligence organizations, at least in the past few decades, have not informed the president properly about what is going on. And indeed, American media, such as the New York Times, have spouted this nonsense, these lies, if you will, every day for years, that, for example, Ukraine is winning the war and Russia is losing the war, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think the question of denial of reality is perhaps the most single important thing, and Congress above all else. Congress clings to this idea that we're the most powerful nation in the world, and seemingly then the most respected, which of course is nonsense. But if I were to advise the president or Congress or Washington, it would be to wake up, smell the coffee, recognize the shifting balances of power within the world, and start acting accordingly, and recognize that the U.S. can and will remain a great power, but it does not mean that it can maintain global hegemony forever. Those days are running out really fast. Do you take that seriously and acknowledge it and move and change accordingly, or do you continue in denial?
David.
I think one of the most impressive features of policymaking in Washington is the extent to which there's no accountability for failure. You can fail catastrophically and again, and you move up in the ranks. That's the way it works. There's no accountability. There's the Iraq War that was fought. It was a disaster. It wasted, what was it, I think, at Brown University, there's a cost of war database. The number I keep seeing, I think, is $5 or $6 trillion for the war on terror combined. $5 or $6 trillion. That's several times, twice, I believe, the size of the British gross domestic product. It's a large figure, and it was wasted for nothing. The Iraq War, obviously, was a disaster, killed 1 million people. Afghanistan, we had a 20-year war, almost 20 years. Taliban are back in power. There was the overthrow of Gaddafi that destabilized the whole of North Africa, really. One could go on. And now we have the Ukraine war, which has been a disaster as well. And the remarkable thing is the people who've made these disasters keep on simply moving up. Look at Victoria Nuland. She was National Security Advisor to Vice President Richard Cheney during the War on Terror. She was an advocate for the War on Terror. And look how that went. And she moved up in the Biden White House. In the Obama White House, she moved seamlessly from the Republicans to the Democrats. That's how these people work. And she moved up in the administration. And she said there's still no accountability. She has a very nice job now at Columbia University. I'm sure she's very likely looking to boards of directors of military contractors and the like. That's what these people do. I assume that's what she's doing. And there's never any sense of accountability. Washington is a non-accountable town. The press don't hold them accountable. Congress doesn't hold them accountable. It's just the way the system works. That's one of the reasons we go from foreign policy disaster to disaster.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Graham and David, for being with us today. Great pleasure to have you both on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nima.
Take care.